Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's Stories. We now return to Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, Part 2, Chapter 32, Tender Trouble. Joe, I'm anxious about Beth. Why, Mother? She has seemed unusually well since the babies came. It's not her health that troubles me now. It's her spirits. I'm sure there is something on her mind, and I want you to discover what it is. What makes you think so, Mother? She sits alone a good deal and doesn't talk to her father as much as she used. I found her crying over the babies the other day. When she sings, the songs are always sad ones. And now and then I see a look in her face that I don't understand. This isn't like Beth, and it worries me. Have you asked her about it? I have tried once or twice, but she either evaded my questions or looked so distressed that I stopped. I never force my children's confidence, and I seldom have to wait for long. Mrs. March glanced at Joe as she spoke, but the face opposite seemed quite unconscious of any secret disquietude. Oh my God. Disquietude?
Disquietude.
Disquietude. Disquietude, a state of uneasiness or anxiety. Mrs. March glanced at Joe as she spoke, but the face opposite seemed quite unconscious of any secret disquietude but Beth's. And after sewing thoughtfully for a minute, Joe said, I think she is growing up and so begins to dream dreams, and have hopes and fears and fidgets without knowing why or being able to explain them. Why, Mother, Beth's 18, but we don't realize it and treat her like a child, forgetting she's a woman. So she is, dear heart. How fast you do grow up, returned her mother with a sigh and a smile. Can't be helped, Mommy, so you must resign yourself to all sorts of worries and let your birds hop out of the nest one by one. I promise never to hop very far if that is any comfort to you. It's a great comfort, Joe. I always feel strong when you are at home. Now Meg is gone. Beth is too feeble and Amy too young to depend upon. But when the tug comes, you are always ready. Why, you know I don't mind hard jobs much. And there must always be one scrub in a family. Amy is splendid in fine works, and I'm not. But I feel in my element when all the carpets are to be taken up, or half the family falls sick at once. Amy is distinguishing herself abroad, but if anything is amiss at home, I'm your man. I leave Beth to your hands then, for she will open her tender little heart to her Joe sooner than to anyone else. Be very kind, and don't let her think anyone watches or talks about her. If she only would get quite strong and cheerful again, I shouldn't have a wish in the world. Happy woman, I've got heaps. My dear, what are they? I'll settle Bethy's troubles, and then I'll tell you mine. They are not very wearing, so they'll keep. And Joe stitched away with a wise nod which set her mother's heart at rest about her, for the present at least. While apparently absorbed in her own affairs, Joe watched Beth, and after many conflicting conjectures, finally settled upon one which seemed to explain the change in her. A slight incident gave Joe the clue to the mystery. She thought, and lively fancy, loving heart did the rest. She was affecting to write busily one Saturday afternoon, when she and Beth were alone together. Yet as she scribbled, she kept her eye on her sister, who seemed unusually quiet. Sitting at the window, Beth's work often dropped into her lap, and she leaned her head upon her hand in a dejected attitude, while her eyes rested on the dull autumnal landscape. Suddenly, someone passed below, whistling like an operatic blackbird, and a voice called out, "All serene, coming in tonight." Beth started and leaned forward, smiled and nodded, watched the passer-by till his quick tramp died away, then said softly as if to herself, "How strong and well and happy that dear boy looks." Said Joe, still intent upon her sister's face, for the bright color faded as quickly as it came. The smile vanished, and presently a tear lay shining on the window ledge. Beth whisked it off, and in her half-averted face read a tender sorrow that made her own eyes fill. Fearing to betray herself, she slipped away, murmuring something about needing more paper. "Mercy on me, Beth loves Laurie," she said, sitting down in her own room, pale with the shock of the discovery which she believed she had just made. "I never dreamed of such a thing. What will Mother say? I wonder if her—" There Joe stopped and turned scarlet with a sudden thought. If he shouldn't love back again, how dreadful it would be. He must. I'll make him. And she shook her head threateningly at the picture of the mischievous-looking boy laughing at her from the wall. Oh dear, we are growing up with a vengeance. Here's Meg married, and her mama, Amy flourishing away at Paris, and Beth in love. I'm the only one that has sense enough to keep out of mischief. Joe thought intently for a minute, with her eyes fixed on the picture. Then she smoothed out her wrinkled forehead and said, with a decided nod at the face opposite, "No, thank you, sir. You are very charming, but you've no more stability than a weathercock, so you needn't write touching notes and smile in that insinuating way, for it won't do a bit of good, and I won't have it." Then she sighed and fell into a reverie from which she did not wake till the early twilight sent her down to take new observations, which only confirmed her suspicion. Though Laurie flirted with Amy and joked with Joe, his manner to Beth had always been peculiarly kind and gentle. But so was everybody's. Therefore no one thought of imagining that he cared more for her than for the others. Indeed, a general impression had prevailed in the family of late that our boy was getting fonder than ever of Joe, who, however, wouldn't hear a word upon the subject, and scolded violently if anyone dared to suggest it. If they had known the various tender passages which had been nipped in the bud, they would have had the immense satisfaction of saying, "I told you so." But Joe hated philandering and wouldn't allow it, always having a joke or a smile ready at the least sign of impending danger. When Laurie first went to college, he fell in love about once a month, but these small flames were as brief as ardent, did no damage, and much amused Joe, who took great interest in the alternations of hope, despair, and resignation, which were confided to her in their weekly conferences. But there came a time when Laurie ceased to worship at many shrines, hinted darkly at one all-absorbing passion, and indulged occasionally in Byronic fits of gloom. Then he avoided the tender subject altogether, wrote philosophical notes to Joe, turned studious, and gave out that he was going to dig intending to graduate in a blaze of glory. This suited the young lady better than twilight confidences, tender pressures of the hand, and eloquent glances of the eye, for with Joe, brain developed earlier than heart, and she preferred imaginary heroes to real ones, because when tired of them, the former could be shut up in the tin kitchen till called for, and the latter were less manageable. Things were in this state when the grand discovery was made, and Joe watched Laurie that night as she had never done before. If she had not got the new idea into her head, she would have seen nothing unusual in the fact that Beth was very quiet and Laurie very kind to her. But having given the rein to her lively fancy, it galloped away with her at a great pace, and common sense, being rather weakened by a long course or romance writing, did not come to the rescue. As usual, Beth lay on the sofa, and Laurie sat in a low chair close by, amusing her with all sorts of gossip, for she depended on her weekly spin, and he never disappointed her. But that evening, Joe fancied that Beth's eyes rested on the lively, dark face beside her with peculiar pleasure, and that she listened with intense interest to an account of some exciting cricket match, though the phrase is caught off a tice, stumped off his ground, and the leg hit for 3 were intelligible to her as Sanskrit. She also fancied, having set her heart upon seeing it, that she saw a certain increase of gentleness in Laurie's manner, that he dropped his voice now and then, laughed less than usual, was a little absent-minded, and settled the Afghan over Beth's feet with an assiduity that was really almost tender. Who knows? Stranger things have happened, thought Joe, as she fussed about the room. She will make quite an angel of him, and he will make life delightfully easy and pleasant for the dear, if they only love each other. I don't see how he can help it, and I do believe he would if the rest of us were out of the way. As everyone was out of the way but herself, Joe began to feel that she ought to dispose of herself with all speed. But where should she go? And burning to lay herself upon the shrine of sisterly devotion, she sat down to settle that point. Now the old sofa was a regular patriarch of a sofa, long, broad, well cushioned, and low, a trifle shabby, as well it might be, for the girls had slept and sprawled on it as babies, fished over the back, rode on the arms, and had menageries under it as children, and rested tired heads, dreamed dreams, and listened to tender talk on it as young women. They all loved it, for it was a family refuge, and one corner had always been Joe's favorite lounging place. Among the many pillows that adorned the venerable couch was one, hard, round, covered with prickly horsehair, and furnished with a knobby button at each end. This repulsive pillow was her especial property, being used as a weapon of defense, a barricade, or a stern preventive of too much slumber. Laurie knew this pillow well and had cause to regard it with deep aversion, having been unmercifully pummeled with it in former days, when romping was allowed, and now frequently debarred by it from the seat he most coveted next to Joe in the sofa corner. If the sausage, as he called it, stood on end, it was a sign that he might approach and repose, but if it lay flat across the sofa, woe to man, woman, or child who dared disturb it. That evening, Joe forgot to barricade her corner, and had not been in her seat 5 minutes before a massive form appeared beside her, and with both arms spread over the sofa back, both long legs stretched out before him, Laurie exclaimed with a sigh of satisfaction. Now this is filling at the price. No slang, snapped Joe, slamming down the pillow, but it was too late. There was no room for it, and coasting onto the floor it disappeared in a most mysterious manner. Come, Joe, don't be thorny. After studying himself to a skeleton all week, a fellow deserves petting and ought to get it. Beth will pet you. I'm busy. No, she's not to be bothered with me, but you like that sort of thing, unless you've suddenly lost your taste for it. Have you? Do you hate your boy and want to fire pillows at him? Anything more wheedlesome than that touching appeal was seldom heard, but Joe quenched her boy by turning on him with a stern query. How many bouquets have you sent Miss Randall this week? Not one, upon my word. She's engaged now then. I'm glad of it. That's one of your foolish extravagances, sending flowers and things to girls for whom you don't care two pins, continued Joe reprovingly. Sensible girls for whom I do care whole papers of pins won't let me send them flowers and things, so what can I do? My feelings need a vent. Mother doesn't approve of flirting even in fun, and you do flirt desperately, Teddy. I'd give anything if I could answer. So do you, as I can't. I'll merely say that I don't see any harm in that pleasant little game if all parties understand that it's only play. Well, it does look pleasant, but I can't learn how it's done. I've tried, because one feels awkward in company not to do as everybody else is doing. But I don't seem to get on, said Joe, forgetting to play mentor. Take lessons of Amy. She has a regular talent for it. Yes, she does it very prettily and never seems to go too far. I suppose it's natural to some people to please without trying, and others to always say and do the wrong thing in the wrong place. I'm glad you can't flirt. It's really refreshing to see a sensible, straightforward girl who can be jolly and kind without making a fool of herself. Between ourselves, Joe, some of the girls I know really do go on at such a rate, I'm afraid of them. They don't mean any harm, I'm sure, but if they knew how we fellows talked about them afterward, they'd mend their ways, I fancy. They do the same, and as their tongues are the sharpest, you fellows get the worst of it, for you are as silly as they, every bit. If you behaved properly, they would, but knowing you like their nonsense, they keep it up, and then you blame them. Much you know about it, ma'am, said Laurie in a superior tone. We don't like romps and flirts, though we may act as if we did sometimes. The pretty modest girls are never talked about, except respectfully among gentlemen. Bless your innocent soul. If you could be in my place for a month, you'd see things that would astonish you a trifle. Upon my word, when I see one of those harum-scarum girls, I always want to say with our friend Cock Robin, out upon you, fie upon you, bold-faced jig. It was impossible to help laughing at the funny conflict between Laurie's chivalrous reluctance to speak ill of womankind and his very natural dislike of the unfeminine folly of which fashionable society showed him many samples. Joe knew that young Lawrence was regarded as a most eligible party by worldly mammas, was much smiled upon by the daughters, and flattered enough by ladies of all ages to make a coxcomb of him. So she watched him rather jealously, fearing he would be spoiled, and rejoiced more than she confessed to find that he still believed in modest girls. Returning suddenly to her admonitory tone, she said, dropping her voice, If you must have a wind, Teddy, go and devote yourself to one of the pretty, modest girls whom you do respect, and not waste your time with the silly ones. You really advise it? And Laurie looked at her with an odd mixture of anxiety and merriment in his face. Yes, I do, but you'd better wait till you are through college on the whole and be fitting yourself for the place meantime. You're not half good enough for, well, whoever the modest girl may be. And Joe looked a little queer likewise, for a name had almost escaped her. That I'm not, acquiesced Laurie.
Acquiesced.
Acquiesce. Accept something without protest. Acquiesce. Permit. That I'm not, acquiesced Laurie, with an expression of humility quite new to him, as he dropped his eyes and absently wound Joe's apron tassel round his finger. Mercy on us, this will never do, thought Joe, adding aloud. Go on, go and sing to me. I'm dying for some music, and always like yours. I'd rather stay here, thank you. Well, you can't. There isn't room. Go and make yourself useful, since you are too big to be ornamental. I thought you hated to be tied to a woman's apron string, retorted Joe, quoting certain rebellious words of his own. Ah, that depends on who wears the apron. And Laura gave an audacious tweak at the tassel. Are you going? Demanded Joe, diving for the pillow. He fell at once, and the minute it was well up with the bonnets of Bonnie Dundee, she slipped away to return no more till the young gentleman departed in high dudgeon. Joe lay long awake that night, and was just dropping off when the sound of a stifled sob made her fly to Beth's bedside with the anxious inquiry, What is it, dear? I thought you were asleep, sobbed Beth. Is it the old pain, my precious? No, it's a new one, but I can bear it. And Beth tried to check her tears. Tell me all about it, and let me cure it as often as I did the other. You can't. There is no cure. There, Beth's voice gave way, and clinging to her sister, she cried, so despairingly that Joe was frightened. Where is it? Shall I call Mother? No, don't call her. Don't tell her. I shall be better soon. Lie down here and pour my head. I'll be quiet and go to sleep, indeed I will. Joe obeyed, but as her hand went softly to and fro across Beth's hot forehead and wet eyelids, her heart was very full, and she longed to speak. But young as she was, Joe had learned that hearts, like flowers, cannot be rudely handled, but must open naturally. So though she believed she knew the cause of Beth's new pain, she only said in her tenderest tone, Does anything trouble you, dearie? Yes, Joe, after a long pause. Wouldn't it comfort you to tell me what it is? Not now. Not yet. Then I won't ask. But remember, Bethy, that Mother and Joe are always glad to hear and help you if they can. I know it. I'll tell you by and by. Is the pain better now? Oh, yes, much better. You are so comfortable, Joe. Go to sleep, dear. I'll stay with you. So cheek to cheek, they fell asleep. And on the morrow, Beth seemed quite herself again. For at 18, neither hands nor heart aches long. For at 18, neither heads nor hearts ache long. And a loving word can medicine most ills. But Joe had made up her mind, and after pondering over a project for some days, she confided it to her mother. You asked me the other day what my wishes were. I'll tell you one of them, Mommy, she began as they sat alone together. I want to go away somewhere this winter for a change. Why, Joe? and her mother looked up quickly, as if the words suggested a double meaning. With her eyes on her work, Jo answered soberly, "I want something new. I feel restless and anxious to be seeing, doing, and learning more than I am. I brood too much over my own small affairs and need stirring up, so as I can be spared this winter, I'd like to hop a little way and try my wings." "Where will you hop?" "To New York. I had a bright idea yesterday, and this is it. You know Mrs. Kirk wrote to you for some respectable young person to teach her children, and so it's rather hard to find just the thing, but I think I should suit it if I tried." "My dear, go out to service in that great boarding house?" And Mrs. March looked surprised but not displeased. "It's not exactly going out to service, for Mrs. Kirk is your friend, the kindest soul that ever lived, and would make things pleasant for me. I know. Her family is separate from the rest, and no one knows me there. Don't care if they do. It's honest work, and I'm not ashamed of it." "Nor I, but your writing." "All the better for the change. I shall see and hear new things, get new ideas, and even if I haven't much time there, I shall bring home quantities of material for my rubbish." "I have no doubt of it, but are these your only reasons for this sudden fancy?" "No, Mother." "May I know the others?" Jo looked up and Jo looked down, then said slowly with sudden color in her cheeks, "It may be vain and wrong to say it, but I'm afraid Laurie is getting too fond of me." "Then you don't care for him in the way it is evident he begins to care for you?" And Mrs. March looked anxious as she put the question. "Mercy, no. I love the dear boy as I always have, and am immensely proud of him. But as for anything more, it's out of the question." "I'm glad of that, Jo." "Why, please?" "Because, dear, I don't think you suited to one another. As friends you are very happy, and your frequent quarrels soon blow over, but I fear you would both rebel if you were mated for life. You are too much alike and too fond of freedom, not to mention hot tempers and strong wills, to get on happy together in a relation which needs infinite patience and forbearance, as well as love." "That's just the feeling I had, though I couldn't express it. I'm glad you think he is only beginning to care for me, and it would trouble me sadly to make him unhappy, for I couldn't fall in love with the dear old fellow merely out of gratitude, could I?" "You are sure of his feeling for you?" The color deepened in Jo's cheeks as she answered, with the look of mingled pleasure, pride, and pain, which young girls wear when speaking of first lovers. "I'm afraid it is so, Mother. He hasn't said anything, but he looks a great deal. I think I had better go away before it comes to anything." "I agree with you, and if it can be managed, you shall go." Jo looked relieved, and after a pause said, smiling, "How Mrs. Muffet would wonder at your want of management if she knew, and how she will rejoice that Annie may still hope." "Ah, Jo, mothers may differ in their management, but the hope is the same in all, the desire to see their children happy. Meg is so, and I am content with her success. You I leave to enjoy your liberty till you tire of it, for only then you will find that there is something sweeter. Amy is my chief care now, but her good sense will help her. For Beth, I indulge no hopes except that she may be well. By the way, she seems brighter this last day or two. Have you spoken to her?" "Yes, she owned she had a trouble and promised to tell me by and by. I said no more, for I think I know it." And Jo told her little story. Mrs. March shook her head and did not take so romantic a view of the case, but looked grave, and repeated her opinion that for Laurie's sake Jo should go away for a time. Let us say nothing about it to him till the plan is settled. Then I'll run away before he can collect his wits and be tragic. Beth must think I'm going to please myself, as I am, for I can't talk about Laura to her, but she can pet and comfort him after I'm gone, and so cure him of this romantic notion. He's been through so many little trials of the sort he's used to it, and will soon get over his love-lornity. Jo spoke hopefully, but could not rid herself of the foreboding fear that this little trial would be harder than the others, and that Laurie would not get over his love-lornity as easily as heretofore. The plan was talked over in a family council and agreed upon, for Mrs. Kirk gladly accepted Jo and promised to make a pleasant home for her. The teaching would render her independent, and such leisure as she got might be made profitable by writing, while the new scenes in society would be both useful and agreeable. Jo liked the prospect and was eager to be gone, for the home nest was growing too narrow for her restless nature and adventurous spirit. When all was settled with fear and trembling, as she told Laurie, she told Laurie, but to her surprise he took it very quietly. He had been graver than usual of late, but very pleasant, and when jokingly accused of turning over a new leaf, he answered soberly, "So I am, and I mean this one shall stay turned. So I am, and I mean this one shall stay turned." Jo was very much relieved that one of his virtuous fits should come on just then, and made her preparations with a lightened heart, for Beth seemed more cheerful and hoped she was doing the best for all. "One thing I leave in your especial care," she said the night before she left. "You mean your papers?" asked Beth. No, my boy. Be very good to him, won't you?" "Of course I will, but I can't fill your place, and he'll miss you sadly." "It won't hurt him, so remember, I leave him in your charge to play, pet, and keep in order." "I'll do my best, for your sake," promised Beth, wondering why Jo looked at her so queerly. When Laurie said goodbye, he whispered significantly, "It won't do a bit of good, Jo. My eye is on you, so mind what you do, or I'll come and bring you home." Chapter 33. Jo's Journal. New York, November. Dear Mommy and Beth, I'm going to write you a regular volume, for I've got heaps to tell. Though I'm not a fine young lady traveling on the continent, when I lost sight of Father's dear old face, I felt a trifle blue and might have shed a briny drop or two. If an Irish lady with 4 small children, all crying more or less, hadn't diverted my mind, for I amused myself by dropping gingerbread nuts over the seat every time they opened their mouths to roar. Soon the sun came out, and taking it as a good omen, I cleared up likewise and enjoyed my journey with all my heart. Mrs. Kirk welcomed me so kindly I felt at home at once, even in that big house full of strangers. She gave me a funny little sky parlor, all she had, but there is a stove in it, and a nice table in a sunny window, so I can sit here and write whenever I like. A fine view in the church tower opposite atoned for the many stairs, and I took a fancy to my den on the spot. The nursery where I am to teach and sew is a pleasant room next Mrs. Kirk's private parlor, and the 2 little girls are pretty children, rather spoiled, I fancy, but they took to me after telling them the 7 bad pigs. and I've no doubt I shall make a model governess. I am to have my meals with the children, if I prefer it, to the great table, and for the present I do, for I am bashful, though no one will believe it. Now, my dear, make yourself at home, said Mrs. K in her motherly way. I'm on the drive from morning to night, as you may suppose, with such a family. But a great anxiety will be off my mind if I know the children are safe with you. My rooms are always open to you, and your own shall be as comfortable as I can make it. There are some pleasant people in the house if you feel sociable, and your evenings are always free. Come to me if anything goes wrong, and be as happy as you can. There's the tea bell. I must run and change my cap. And off she bustled, leaving me to settle myself in my new nest. As I went downstairs soon after, I saw something I liked. The flights are very long in this tall house, and as I stood waiting at the head of the third one for a little servant girl to lumber up, I saw a gentleman come along behind her, take the heavy hod of coal out of her hand, carry it all the way up, put it down at a door nearby, and walk away saying, with a kind of nod and a foreign accent, "It goes better so. The little back is too young to have such heaviness." Wasn't it good of him? I like such things, for as father says, trifles show character. When I mentioned it to Mrs. K that evening, she laughed and said, "That must have been Professor Bayer. He's always doing things of that sort." Mrs. K told me he was from Berlin, very learned and good, but poor as a church mouse, and gives lessons to support himself and two little orphan nephews whom he is educating here, according to the wishes of his sister who married an American. Not a very romantic story, but it interested me, and I was glad to hear that Mrs. K lends him her parlor for some of his scholars. There is a glass door between it and the nursery, and I mean to peep at him, and then I'll tell you how he looks. He's almost 40, so it's no harm, Mommy. After tea and a go-to-bed romp with the little girls, I attacked the big work basket and had a quiet evening chatting with my new friend. I shall keep a journal letter and send it once a week, so good night and more tomorrow. Tuesday Eve. Had a lively time in my seminary this morning, for the children acted like Sancho, and at one time I really thought I should shake them all round. Some good angels inspired me to try gymnastics, and I kept it up till they were glad to sit down and keep still. After luncheon, the girl took them out for a walk, and I went to my needlework like little Mabel with a willing mind. I was thanking my stars that I'd learned to make nice buttonholes when the parlor door opened and shut, and someone began to hum "Canst du das Land" like a big bumblebee. It was dreadfully improper, I know, but I couldn't resist the temptation, and lifting one end of the curtain before the glass door, I peeped in. Professor Bayer was there, and while he arranged his books, I took a good look at him. A regular German, rather stout, with brown hair tumbled all over his head, a bushy beard, good nose, the kindest eyes I ever saw, and a splendid big voice that does one's ears good. After our sharp or slipshod American gabble, his clothes were rusty, his hands were large, and he hadn't a really handsome feature in his face, except his beautiful teeth. Yet I liked him, for he had a fine head, his linen was very nice, and he looked like a gentleman. though 2 buttons were off his coat, and there was a patch on one shoe. He looked sober in spite of his humming, till he went to the window to turn the hyacinth bulbs toward the sun.
Hyacinth.
Hyacinth, a bulbous plant of the lily family with strap-like leaves and a compact spike of bell-shaped fragrant flowers, native to Western Asia. Hyacinths are cultivated outdoors as houseplants.
Hyacinth.
He looked sober in spite of his humming, till he went to the window to turn the hyacinth bulbs toward the sun, and stroked the cat who received him like an old friend. Then he smiled, and when a tap came at the door, called out in a loud, brisk tone, "Herein!" I was just going to run when I caught sight of a morsel of a child carrying a big book and stopped to see what was going on. "Me wants me bear," said the mite, slamming down her book and running to meet him. "Thou shalt have thy bear. Come then, and take a good hug from him, my Tina," said the professor, catching her up with a laugh. And holding her so high over his head that she had to stoop her little face to kiss him. "Now me must study my lesson," went on the funny little thing. So he put her up at the table, opened the great dictionary she had brought, and gave her a paper and pencil, and she scribbled away, turning a leaf now and then, and passing her little fat finger down the page as if finding a word, so soberly that I nearly betrayed myself by a laugh, while Mr. Bayer stood stroking her pretty hair with a fatherly look that made me think she must be his own, though she looked more French than German. Another knock and the appearance of 2 young ladies sent me back to my work, and there I virtuously remained through all the noise and gabbling that went on next door. One of the girls kept laughing affectedly and saying, "Now, Professor," in a coquettish tone, and the other pronounced her German with an accent that must have made it hard for him to keep sober. Both seemed to try his patience sorely, for more than once I heard him saying emphatically, "No, no, it is not so. You have not attended to what I say." And once there was a loud rap as if he struck the table with his book, followed by the despairing exclamation, "Prut, it all goes bad this day." Poor man, I pitied him, and when the girls were gone, took just one more peep to see if he survived it. He seemed to have thrown himself back in his chair, tired out, and sat there with his eyes shut till the clock struck 2, when he jumped up, put his books in his pocket as if ready for another lesson, and taking little Tina, who had fallen asleep on the sofa, in his arms, he carried her quietly away. I fancy he has a hard life of it. Mrs. Kirk asked me if I wouldn't go down to the 5 o'clock dinner, and feeling a little bit homesick, I thought I would, just to see what sort of people are under the same roof with me. So I made myself respectable and tried to slip in behind Mrs. Kirk, but as she is short and I'm tall, my efforts at concealment were rather a failure. She gave me a seat by her, and after my face cooled off, I plucked up courage and looked about me. The long table was full, everyone intent on getting their dinner, the gentlemen especially, who seemed to be eating on time, for they bolted in every sense of the word, vanishing as soon as they were done. There was the usual assortment of young men absorbed in themselves, young couples absorbed in each other, married ladies in their babies, old gentlemen in politics, I don't think I shall care to have much to do with any of them, except one sweet-faced maiden lady who looks as if she had something in her. Cast away at the very bottom of the table was the professor, shouting answers to the questions of a very inquisitive, deaf old gentleman on one side, and talking philosophy with a Frenchman on the other. If Amy had been there, she'd have turned her back on him forever, because, sad to relate, he had a great appetite, and shoveled in his dinner in a manner which would have horrified her ladyship. I didn't mind, for I like to see folks eat with a relish, as Hannah says, and the poor man must have needed a deal of food after teaching idiots all day. I went upstairs after dinner. Two of the young men were settling their hats before the hall mirror, and I heard one say low to the other, "Who's the new party? Governess or something of that sort. What the deuce is she at our table for? Friend of the old lady's. Handsome head, but no style. Not a bit of it. Give us a light and come on." I felt angry at first, and then I didn't care, for a governess is as good as a clerk, and I've got sense, if I haven't style, which is more than some people have, judging from the remarks of the elegant beings who clattered away, smoking like bad chimneys. I hate ordinary people. Thursday. Yesterday was a quiet day spent in teaching, sewing, and writing in my little room, which is very cozy, with a light and fire. I picked up a few bits of news and was introduced to the professor. It seems that Tina is the child of the Frenchwoman who does the fine ironing in the laundry here. The little thing has lost her heart to Mr. Bayer, and follows him about the house like a dog whenever he is at home, which delights him, as he is very fond of children, though a bachelor. Kitty and Minnie Kirk likewise regard him with affection, and tell all sorts of stories about the plays he invents, the presents he brings, and the splendid tales he tells. The younger men quiz him, it seems, call him Old Fritz, Lagerbeer, Ursa Major, and make all manner of jokes on his name. But he enjoys it like a boy, Mrs. Kirk says, and takes it so good-naturedly that they all like him in spite of his foreign ways. The maiden lady is a Miss Norton, rich, cultivated, and kind. She spoke to me at dinner today, for I went to table again. It's such fun to watch people. And asked me to come and see her at her room. She has fine books and pictures, knows interesting persons, and seems friendly, so I shall make myself agreeable, for I do want to get into good society, only it isn't the same sort that Amy likes. It was in our parlor last evening when Mr. Bayer came in with some newspapers for Mrs. Kirk. She wasn't there, but Minnie, who is a little old woman, introduced me very prettily. "This is Mama's friend, Miss March." "Yes, and she's jolly, and we like her lots," added Kitty, who is an enfant terrible. We both bowed, and then we laughed. For the prim introduction and the blunt addition were rather a comical contrast. "Ah, yes, I heard these naughty ones go to vex you, Miss Marsh. If so again, call at me, and I come," he said, with a threatening frown that delighted the little wretches. I promised I would, and he departed, but it seems as if I was doomed to see a good deal of him, for today, as I passed his door on my way out, by accident I knocked against it with my umbrella. It flew open, and there he stood in his dressing gown, with a big blue sock on one hand and a darning needle in the other. He didn't seem at all ashamed of it, for when I explained and hurried on, he waved his hand, sock and all, saying in his loud, cheerful way, "You have a fine day to make your walk. Bon voyage, mademoiselle." I laughed all the way downstairs. But it was a little pathetic. Also to think of the poor man having to mend his own clothes. The German gentlemen embroider, I know, but darning hose is another thing, and not so pretty. Saturday. Nothing has happened to write about except a call on Miss Norton, who has a room full of pretty things, and who was very charming, but she showed me all her treasures and asked me if I would sometimes go with her to lectures and concerts as her escort, if I enjoyed them. She put it as a favor, but I'm sure Mrs. Cook has told her about us, and she does it out of kindness to me. I'm as proud as Lucifer, but such favors from such people don't burden me, and I accept it gratefully. When I got back to the nursery, there was such an uproar in the parlor that I looked in, and there was Mr. Bayer down on his hands and knees with Tina on his back, Kitty leading him with a jump rope, and Minnie feeding two small boys with seed cakes as they roared and ramped in cages built of chairs. "We are playing Lingerie," explained Kitty. "This is mine effluent," added Tina, holding on by the professor's hair. "Mama always allows us to do what we like Saturday afternoon when Franz and Emil come, doesn't she, Mr. Bayer?" said Minnie. The effluent sat up, looking as much in earnest as any of them, and said soberly to me, "I give you my word, it is so. If we make too large a noise, you shall say hush to us, and we go more softly." I promised to do so, but left the door open and enjoyed the fun as much as they did, for a more glorious frolic I never witnessed. They played tag and soldiers, danced and sang, and when it began to grow dark, they all piled onto the sofa about the professor, while he told charming fairy stories of the storks on the chimney tops, and the little coblards who ride the snowflakes as they fall. I wish Americans were as simple and natural as Germans, don't you? I'm so fond of writing, I should go spinning on forever if motives of economy didn't stop me. For though I've used thin paper and written fine, I tremble to think of the stamps this long letter will need. Pray forward Amy's as soon as you can spare them. My small news will sound very flat after her splendors, but you will like them, I know. Is Teddy studying so hard that he can't find time to write his friends? Take good care of him for me, Beth, and tell me all about the babies, and give heaps of love to everyone. From your faithful Joe. P.S. On reading over my letter, it strikes me as rather Bayery, but I am always interested in odd people, and I really had nothing else to write about. Bless you. December. My precious Betsy, as this is to be a scribble-scrabble letter, I direct it to you, for it may amuse you and give you some idea of my goings-on, for though quiet, they are rather amusing, for which, oh, be joyful. After what Amy would call Herculaneum efforts in the way of mental and moral agriculture, my young ideas begin to shoot, and my little twigs to bend as I could wish. They are not so interesting to me as Tina and the boys, but I do my duty by them, and they are fond of me. Franz and Emil are jolly little lads, quite after my own heart, for the mixture of German and American spirit in them produces a constant state of effervescence. Saturday afternoons are riotous times, whether spent in the house or out, for on pleasant days they all go to walk, like a seminary, with the professor and myself to keep order, and then such fun. We are very good friends now, and I've begun to take lessons. I really couldn't help it, and it all came about in such a droll way that I must tell you. To begin at the beginning, Mrs. Kirk called to me one day as I passed Mr. Bayer's room where she was rummaging. Did you ever see such a den, my dear? Just come and help me put these books to rights, for I've turned everything upside down, trying to discover what he has done with the 6 new handkerchiefs I gave him not long ago. I went in, and while we worked, I looked about me, for it was a den to be sure. Books and papers everywhere, a broken meerschaum,
Meerschaum.
Meerschaum, a soft, white, clay-like material consisting of hydrated magnesium silicate found chiefly in Turkey. Meerschaum. A tobacco pipe with a bowl made from meerschaum. Books and papers everywhere, a broken meerschaum, and an old flute over the mantelpiece, as if done with a ragged bird without any tail, chirp on one window seat, and a box of white mice adorned the other. Half-finished boats and bits of string lay among the manuscripts. Dirty little boots stood drying before the fire, and traces of the dearly beloved boys, for whom he makes a slave of himself, were to be seen all over the room. After a grand rummage, 3 of the missing articles were found, one over the bird cage, one covered with ink, and a third burned down, having been used as a holder. Such a man! Laughed good-natured Mrs. K as she put the relics in the rag bay. I suppose the others are torn up to rig ships, bandage cut fingers, or make kite tails. It's dreadful, but I can't scold him. He's so absent-minded and good-natured. He lets those boys ride over him roughshod. I agreed to do his washing and mending, but he forgets to give out his things, and I forget to look them over, so he comes to a sad pass sometimes. Let me mend them, said I. I don't mind it, and he needn't know. I'd like to. He's so kind to me about bringing my letters and lending books. So I have got his things in order, and knit heels into 2 pairs of the socks, for they were boggled out of shape with his queer dons. Nothing was said, and I hoped he wouldn't find it out. But one day last week, he caught me at it. Hearing the lessons he gives to others has interested and amused me so much. Hearing the lessons he gives to others has interested and amused me so much that I took a fancy to learn, for Tina runs in and out, leaving the door open, and I can hear. I had been sitting near this door, finishing off the last sock and trying to understand what he said to a new scholar who is as stupid as I am. The girl had gone, and I thought he had also. It was so still, and I was busily gabbling over a verb and rocking to and fro in a most absurd way, when a little crow made me look up. And there was Mr. Bear looking and laughing quietly while he made signs to Tina not to betray him. "So," he said, as I stopped and stared like a goose, "you peep at me, I peep at you, and this is not bad, but see, I am not pleasanting when I say, have you a wish for German?" "Yes, but you are too busy. I am too stupid to learn," I blundered out, as red as a peony. "Prut, we will make the time, and we will fail not to find the sense. At evening I shall give a lesson with much gladness. For look you, Miss Marsh, I have this debt to pay." And he pointed to my work. "Yes," they say to one another, "these so kind ladies. He is a stupid old fellow. He will not see what we do. He will never observe that his sock heels go not in any holes. He will never observe that his sock heels go not in holes any more.
He will think his buttons grow out new when they fall, and believe that strings make themselves. Ah, but I have an eye, and I see much. I have a heart, and I feel thanks for this. Come, a little lesson then and now, oh, no more good fairy works for me and mine.
Of course, I shouldn't say anything after that, and as it really is splendid opportunity, I made the bargain and we began. I took 4 lessons, and then I stuck fast in a grammatical bog. The professor was very patient with me, but it must have been torment to him, and now and then he'd look at me with such an expression of mild despair that it was a toss-up with me whether to laugh or cry. I tried both ways, and when it came to a sniff or utter mortification and woe, he just threw the grammar onto the floor and marched out of the room. I felt myself disgraced and deserted forever, but didn't blame him a particle, and was scrambling my papers together, meaning to rush upstairs and shake myself hard when in he came, as brisk and beaming as if I'd covered myself in glory.
Now we shall try a new way. You and I will read this pleasant little marchen together. And dig no more in that dry book. That goes in the corner for making us trouble.
He spoke so kindly and opened Hans Andersen's fairy tale so invitingly before me that I was more ashamed than ever, and went at my lesson in a neck-or-nothing style that seemed to amuse him immensely. I forgot my bashfulness and pegged away, no other word will express it, with all my might, tumbling over long words, pronouncing according to inspiration of the minute, and doing my best. When I finished reading my page and stopped for breath, he clapped his hands and cried out in his hearty way, "Das ist gut! Now we go well. My turn. I do him in German. Give me your ear." And away he went, rumbling out the words with his strong voice and a relish which was good to see as well as hear. Fortunately, the story was The Constant Tin Soldier, which is droll, you know, so I could laugh, and I did, though I didn't understand half he read, for I couldn't help it. He was so earnest, I so excited, and the whole thing so comical. After that, we got on better, and now I read my lessons pretty well, for this way of studying suits me, and I can see that the grammar gets tucked into the tales and poetry as one gives pills and jelly. I like it very much, and he doesn't seem tired of it yet, which is very good of him, isn't it? I mean to give him something on Christmas, for I dare not offer money. Tell me something nice, Mommy. I'm glad Laurie seems so happy and busy that he has given up smoking and lets his hair grow. You see, Beth manages him better than I did. I'm not jealous, dear. Do your best. Only don't make a saint of him. I'm afraid I couldn't like him without a spice of human naughtiness. Read him bits of my letters. I haven't time to write much, and that will do just as well. Thank heaven, Beth continues, so comfortable. January. A happy new year to you all, my dearest family, which of course includes Mr. L and a young man by the name of Teddy. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed your Christmas bundle, for I didn't get it till night and had given up hoping. Your letter came in the morning, but you said nothing about a parcel, meaning it for a surprise, so I was disappointed, for I'd had a kind of feeling that you wouldn't forget me. I felt a little low in my mind as I sat up in my room after tea, and when the big, muddy, battered-looking bundle was brought to me, I just hugged it and pranced. It was so homey and refreshing that I sat down on the floor and read and looked and ate and laughed and cried in my usual absurd way. The things were just what I wanted, and all the better for being made instead of bought. Beth's new ink bib was capital, and Hannah's box of hard gingerbread will be a treasure. I'll be sure and wear the nice flannels you sent, Mommy, and read carefully the books Father has marked. Thank you all, heaps and heaps. Speaking of books, reminds me that I'm getting rich in that line, for on New Year's Day, Mr. Bayer gave me a fine Shakespeare. It is one he values much, and I've often admired it. Set up in the place of honor with his German Bible, Plato, Homer, and Milton, so you may imagine how I felt when he brought it down, without its cover, and showed me my own name in it. From my friend, Friedrich Bayer.
You say often you wish a library. Here I give you one, for between these lids, he meant covers, as many books in one. Read him well, and he will help you much, for the study of character in this book will help you to read it in the world and paint it with your pen.
I thanked him as well as I could, and talked now about my library as if I had 100 books. I never knew how much there was in Shakespeare before, but then I never had a Bayer to explain it to me. Now don't laugh at his horrid name. It isn't pronounced either bear or beer, as people will say it, but something between the two, as only Germans can give it. I'm glad you both like what I tell you about him, and hope you will know him someday. Mother would admire his warm heart, Father his wise head. I admire both and feel rich in my new friend Friedrich Bayer. Not having much money or knowing what he'd like, I got several little things and put them about the room where he would find them unexpectedly. They were useful, pretty, or fun. A new standish on his table, a little vase for his flower, he always has one, or a bit of green in the glass to keep him fresh, he says, and a holder for his blower, so that he needn't burn up what Amy calls mouchoirs. I made it like those Beth invented, a big butterfly with a fat body and black and yellow wings, worsted feelers and bead eyes. It took his fancy immensely, and he put it on his mantelpiece as an article of virtue, so it was rather a failure after all. Poor as he is, he didn't forget a servant or a child in the house, and not a soul here, from the French laundrywoman to Miss Norton, forgot him. I was so glad of that. They got up a masquerade and had a gay time New Year's Eve. I didn't mean to go down having no dress, but at the last minute Mrs. Kirk remembered some old brocades, and Miss Norton lent me lace and feathers, so I dressed up as Mrs. Malaprop and sailed in with a mask on. No one knew me, for I disguised my voice, and no one dreamed of the silent, hearty Miss March, for they think I am very stiff and cool, most of them, and so I am to whippersnappers. For I disguised my voice, and no one dreamed of the silent, hearty Miss March could dance and dress and burst out into a nice derangement of epitaphs, like an allegory on the banks of the Nile. I enjoyed it very much, and when we unmasked, it was fun to see them all stare at me. I heard one of the young men tell another that he knew I'd been an actress. In fact, he thought he remembered seeing me at one of the minor theaters. Meg will relished that joke. Mr. Bear was Nick Bottom, and Tina was Titania, a perfect little fairy in his arms. To see them dance was quite a landscape, to use a Teddyism. I had a very happy New Year after all, and when I thought it over in my room, I felt as if I was getting on a little in spite of my many failures. For I'm cheerful all the time now, work with a will, and take more interest in other people than I used to, which is satisfactory. Bless you all, ever, your loving Joe. Chapter 34. A Friend. Though very happy in the social atmosphere about her, and very busy with the daily work that earned her bread and made it sweeter for the effort, Jo still found time for literary labors. The purpose which now took possession of her was a natural one to a poor and ambitious girl. But the means she took to gain her end were not the best. She saw that money conferred power. Money and power, therefore, she resolved to have, not to be used for herself alone, but for those whom she loved more than life. The dream of filling home with comforts, giving Beth everything she wanted, from strawberries in winter to an organ in her bedroom, going abroad herself and always having more than enough, so that she might indulge in the luxury of charity, had been for years Jo's most cherished castle in the air. The prize story experience had seemed to open a way which might, after long traveling and much uphill work, lead to this delightful chateau on Espagne. But the novel disaster quenched her courage for a time, for public opinion is a giant which has frightened stouter-hearted jacks on bigger beanstalks than hers. Like that immortal hero, she reposed a while after the first attempt, which resulted in a tumble and the least lovely of the giant's treasures, if I remember rightly. But the up again and take another spirit was as strong in Jo as in Jack. So she scrambled up on the shady side this time and got more booty, but nearly left behind her what was far more precious than the money bags. She took to writing sensation stories, for in those dark ages, even all perfect America read rubbish. She told no one, but concocted a thrilling tale, and boldly carried it herself to Mr. Dashwood, editor of the Weekly Volcano. She had never read Sartor Resartus, but she had a womanly instinct that clothes possess an influence more powerful over many than the worth of character or the magic of manners. So she dressed herself in her best, and trying to persuade herself that she was neither excited nor nervous, bravely climbed 2 pairs of dark and dirty stairs to find herself in a disorderly room, a cloud of cigar smoke, and the presence of 3 gentlemen sitting with their heels rather higher than their hats, which articles of dress none of them took the trouble to remove on her appearance. Somewhat daunted by this reception, Jo hesitated on the threshold, murmuring in much embarrassment, "Excuse me, I was looking for the Weekly Volcano office. I wish to see Mr. Dashwood." Down went the highest pair of heels, up rose the smokiest gentleman, and carefully cherishing his cigar between his fingers, he advanced with a nod and a countenance expressive of nothing but sleep. Feeling that she must get through the matter somehow, Jo produced her manuscript, and blushing redder and redder with each sentence, blundered out fragments of the little speech carefully prepared for the occasion. "A friend of mine desired me to offer a story, just as an experiment. Would like your opinion. Be glad to write more if this suits." While she blushed and blundered, Mr. Dashwood had taken the manuscript and was turning over the leaves with a pair of rather dirty fingers and casting critical glances up and down the neat pages. "Not a first attempt, I take it?" Observing that the pages were numbered, covered only on one side, and not tied up with a ribbon, sure sign of a novice. "No, sir. She has had some experience and got a prize for a tale in the Blarney Stone Banner." "Oh, did she?" and Mr. Dashwood gave Joe a quick look which seemed to take note of everything she had on, from the bow in her bonnet to the buttons on her boots. "Well, you can leave it if you like. We've more of this sort of thing on hand than we know what to do with at the present, but I'll run my eye over it and give you an answer next week." Now, Joe did not like to leave it, for Mr. Dashwood didn't suit her at all, but under the circumstances there was nothing for her to do but bow and walk away, looking particularly tall and dignified, as she was apt to do when nettled or abashed. Just then she was both, for it was perfectly evident from the knowing glances exchanged among the gentlemen that her little fiction of "my friend" was considered a good joke, and a laugh, produced by some inaudible remark of the editor as he closed the door, completed her discomfiture. Having resolved never to return, she went home, worked off her irritation by stitching pinafores vigorously, and in an hour or two was cool enough to laugh over the scene and long for next week. When she went again, Mr. Dashwood was alone, whereat she rejoiced. Mr. Dashwood was much wide awake than before, which was agreeable, and Mr. Dashwood was not too deeply absorbed in a cigar to remember his manners, so the second interview was much more comfortable than the first. "We'll take this," editors never say aye, "if you don't object to a few alterations. It's too long, but omitting the passages I've marked will make it just the right length," he said in a business-like tone. Joe hardly knew her own manuscript again, so crumpled and underscored were its pages and paragraphs, but feeling as a tender parent might on being asked to cut off their baby's legs in order that it might fit into a new cradle, she looked at the marked passages and was surprised to find that all the moral reflections which she had carefully put in as ballast for much romance had been stricken out. "But, sir, I thought every story should have some sort of moral, so I took care to have a few of my sinners repent." Mr. Dashwood's editorial gravity relaxed into a smile, for Joe had forgotten her friend and spoken as only an author could. "People want to be amused. Not preached at, morals don't sell nowadays," which was not quite a correct statement, by the way. "You think it would do with these alterations, then?" "Yes, it's a new plot, very well worked up, language good and so on," was Mr. Dashwood's affable reply. What compensation?" began Joe, not exactly knowing how to express herself. "Oh, yes, well, we give from 25 to 34. We give from 25 to 30 for things of this sort. Pay when it comes out," returned Mr. Dashwood, as if that point had escaped him. Such trifles do escape the editorial mind, it is said. "Very well, you can have it," said Joe, handing back the story with a satisfied air, for after the dollar a column work, and even 25 seemed good pay. For after the dollar a column work, even 25 seemed good pay. "Shall I tell my friend you will take another if she has one better than this?" asked Joe, unconscious of the little slip of the tongue and emboldened by her success. "Well, we'll look at it. Can't promise to take it. Tell her to make it short and spicy, and never mind the moral. What name would your friend like to put on it?" in a careless tone. "None at all, if you please. Doesn't wish her name to appear, and has no nom de plume," said Joe, blushing in spite of herself. "Just as she likes, of course. The tale will be out next week. Will you call for the money, or shall I send it?" asked Mr. Dashwood, who felt a natural desire to know who his new contributor might be. "I'll call. Good morning, sir." As she departed, Mr. Dashwood put his feet up with a graceful remark, "Poor and proud as usual, but she'll do." Following Mr. Dashwood's directions and making Mrs. Northbury her model, Joe rashly took a plunge into the frothy sea of sensational literature. But thanks to the life preserver thrown her by a friend, she came up again not much the worse for her ducking. Like most subscribers, she went abroad for her characters and scenery and banditti. Counts, gypsies, nuns, and duchesses appeared upon her stage and played their parts with as much accuracy and spirit as could be expected. Her readers were not particular about such trifles as grammar, punctuation, and probability, and Mr. Dashwood graciously permitted her to fill his columns at the lowest prices, not thinking it necessary to tell her that the real cause of his hospitality was the fact that one of his hacks, on being offered high wages, had basically left him in the lurch. She soon became interested in her work, for her emaciated purse grew stout, and the little hoard she was making to take Beth to the mountains next summer grew slowly but surely as the weeks passed. One thing disturbed her satisfaction, and that was that she did not tell them at home. She had a feeling that father and mother would not approve, and preferred to have her own way first and beg pardon afterward. It was easy to keep her secret, for no name appeared with her stories. Mr. Dashwood had of course found it out very soon, but promised to be dumb, and for a wonder kept his word. She thought it would do her no harm, for she sincerely meant to write nothing of which she would be ashamed, and quieted all pricks of conscience by anticipations of the happy minute when she should show her earnings and laugh over her well-kept secret. But Mr. Dashwood rejected any but thrilling tales, and as thrills could not be produced except by harrowing up the souls of the readers, history and romance, land and sea, science and art, police records and lunatic asylums had to be ransacked for the purpose. Jo soon found that her innocent experience had given her but few glimpses of the tragic world which underlies society. So regarding it in a business light, she set about supplying her deficiencies with characteristic energy. Eager to find material for stories and bent on making them original in plot, if not masterly in execution, she searched newspapers for accidents, incidents, and crimes. She excited the suspicions of public librarians by asking for works on poisons. She studied faces in the street and characters, good, bad, and indifferent, all about her. She delved in the dust of ancient times for facts or fictions so old that they were as good as new, and introduced herself to folly, sin, and misery, as well as her limited opportunities allowed. She thought she was prospering finely, but unconsciously she was beginning to desecrate some of the womanliest attributes of a woman's character. She was living in bad society, and imaginary though it was, its influence affected her, for she was feeding heart and fancy on dangerous and unsubstantial food. For she was feeding heart and fancy on dangerous and unsubstantial food, and was fast brushing the innocent bloom from her nature by a premature acquaintance with the darker side of life, which comes soon enough to all of us. She was beginning to feel rather than see this, for much describing of other people's passions and feelings set her to studying and speculating about her own, a morbid amusement in which healthy young minds do not voluntarily indulge. Wrongdoings always bring its own punishment, and when Jo most needed hers, she got it. I don't know whether the study of Shakespeare helped her to read character, or the natural instinct of a woman, for what was honest, brave, and strong. But while endowing her imaginary heroes with every perfection under the sun, Jo was discovering a live hero who interested her in spite of many human imperfections. Mr. Bayer, in one of their conversations, had advised her to study simple, true, and lovely characters wherever she found them as good training for a writer. Jo took him at his word, for she coolly turned round and studied him, a proceeding which would have much surprised him had he known it, for the worthy professor was very humble in his own conceit. Why everybody liked him was what puzzled Jo at first. He was neither rich nor great, young nor handsome, in no respect what is called fascinating, imposing, or brilliant, and yet he was as attractive as a genial fire, and people seemed to gather about him as naturally as about a warm hearth. To gather about him as naturally as about a warm hearth. He was poor, yet always appeared to be giving something away. A stranger, yet everyone was his friend. No longer young, but as happy-hearted as a boy. Plain and peculiar, yet his face looked beautiful to many, and his oddities were freely forgiven for his sake. Jo often watched him trying to discover the charm, and at last decided that it was benevolence which worked the miracle. If he had any sorrow, it sat with its head under its wing, and he turned only his sunny side to the world, there where lies upon his forehead. But time seemed to have touched him gently, remembering how kind he was to others. The pleasant curves about his mouth were the memorials of many friendly words and cheery laughs. His eyes were never cold or hard, and his big hand had a warm, strong grasp that was more expressive than words. His very clothes seemed to partake of the hospitable nature of the wearer. They looked as if they were at ease, and liked to make him comfortable. His capacious waistcoat was suggestive of a large heart underneath. His rusty coat had a social air, and the baggy pockets plainly proved that little hands often went in empty and came out full. His very boots were benevolent, and his collars never stiff and raspy like other people's. "That's it," said Jo to herself, when she at length discovered that genuine goodwill toward one's fellowmen could beautify and dignify even a stout German teacher who shoveled in his dinner, darned his own socks, and was burdened with the name of bearer. Jo valued goodness highly, but she also possessed the most feminine respect for intellect, and the little discovery which she made about the professor added much to her regard for him. He never spoke of himself, and no one ever knew that in his native city he had been a man much honored and esteemed for learning and integrity, till a countryman came to see him. He never spoke of himself, and in a conversation with Miss Norton divulged the pleasing fact. From her, Jo learned it, and liked it all the better because Mr. Bayer had never told it. She felt proud to know that he was an honored professor in Berlin, though only a poor language master in America, and his homely, hard-working life was much beautified by the spice of romance which this discovery gave it. Another and a better gift than intellect was shown her in a most unexpected manner. Miss Norton had the entry into most society which Jo would have no chance of seeing but for her. The solitary woman felt an interest in the ambitious girl, and kindly conferred many favors of this sort both on Jo and the professor. She took them with her one night to a select symposium held in honor of several celebrities. Jo went prepared to bow down and adore the mighty ones whom she had worshipped with youthful enthusiasm afar off. But her reverence for genius received a severe shock that night, and it took her some time to recover from the discovery that the great creatures were only men and women after all. Imagine her dismay on stealing a glance of timid admiration at the poet whose lines suggested an ethereal being fed on spirit, fire, and dew, to behold him devouring his supper with an ardor which flushed his intellectual countenance. Turning as from a fallen idol, she made other discoveries which rapidly dispelled her romantic illusions. The great novelist vibrated between two decanters with the regularity of a pendulum. The famous divine flirted openly with one of the Madame de Staëls of the age, who looked daggers at another Corinne who was amiably satirizing her. After outmaneuvering her in efforts to absorb the profound philosopher who imbibed tea Joseanally and appeared to slumber. The loquacity of the lady rendering speech impossible. The scientific celebrities, forgetting their mollusks and glacial periods, gossiped about art while devoting themselves to oysters and ices with characteristic energy. The young musician who was charming the city like a second Orpheus talked horses, and the specimen of the British nobility present happened to be the most ordinary man of the party. Before the evening was half over, Jo felt so completely disillusioned that she sat down in a corner to receive herself. Mr. Bear soon joined her, looking rather out of his element, and presently several of the philosophers, each mounted on his hobby, came ambling up to hold an intellectual tournament in the recess. The conversations were miles beyond Jo's comprehension, but she enjoyed it. Though Kant and Hegel were unknown gods, the subjective and objective unintelligible terms, and the only thing evolved from her inner consciousness was a bad headache after it was all over. It dawned upon her gradually that the world was being picked to pieces and put together on new and according to the talkers, on infinitely better principles than before. That religion was in a fair way to be reasoned into nothingness, and intellect was to be the only God. Jo knew nothing about philosophy or metaphysics of any sort, but a curious excitement, half pleasurable, half painful, came over her as she listened, with a sense of being turned adrift into time and space, like a young balloon out on a holiday. She looked round to see how the professor liked it, and found him looking at her with the grimmest expression she had ever seen him wear. He shook his head and beckoned her to come away, but she was fascinated just then by the freedom of speculative philosophy and kept her seat, trying to find out what the wise gentleman intended to rely upon after they had annihilated all the old beliefs. Now Mr. Bayer was a different man, and slow to offer his opinions, not because they were unsettled, but too sincere and earnest to be lightly spoken. As he glanced from Jo to several other young people attracted by the brilliancy of the philosophic pyrotechnics, he knit his brows and longed to speak, fearing that some inflammable young soul would be led astray by the rockets, to find when the display was over that they had only an empty stick or a scorched hand. He bore it as long as he could, but when he was appealed to for an opinion, he blazed up with honest indignation and defended religion with all the eloquence of truth, an eloquence which made his broken English musical and his plain face beautiful. He had a hard fight, for the wise man argued well, but he didn't know when he was beaten, and stood to his color like a man. Somehow, as he talked, the world got right again to Jo. The old beliefs that had lasted so long seemed better than the new. God was not a blind force, and immortality was not a pretty fable, but a blessed fact. She felt as if she had solid ground under her feet again, and when Mr. Bayer paused, out-talked but not one whit convinced, Jo wanted to clap her hands and thank him. She did neither, but she remembered the scene and gave the professor her heartiest respect, for she knew it cost him an effort to speak out then and there, because his conscience would not let him be silent. She began to see that character is a better possession than money, rank, intellect, or beauty, and to feel that if greatness is what a wise man has defined to be truth, reverence, and goodwill, then her friend Friedrich Bayer was not only good, but great. This belief strengthened daily. She valued his esteem. She coveted his respect. She wanted to be worthy of his friendship. And just when the wish was sincerest, she came near to losing everything. It all grew out of a cocked hat. For one evening the professor came in to give Jo her lesson with a paper soldier cap on his head, which Tina had put there, and he had forgotten to take off. It is evident he doesn't look in his glass before coming down, thought Jo with a smile, as he said, "Good evening," and sat soberly down, quite unconscious of the ludicrous contrast between his subject and his headgear, for he was going to read her The Death of Wallenstein. She said nothing at first, for she liked to hear him laugh out his big hearty laugh when anything funny happened, so she left him to discover it for himself, and presently forgot all about it, for to hear a German read Schiller is rather an absorbing occupation. After the reading came the lesson, which was a lively one, for Jo was in a gay mood that night, and the cocked hat kept her eyes dancing with merriment. The professor didn't know what to make of her, and stopped at last to ask, with an air of mild surprise that was irresistible,
"Miss March, for why do you laugh in your master's face? Have you no respect for me that you go on so bad?"
"How can I be respectful, sir, when you forget to take your hat off?" said Jo. Lifting his hand to his head, the absent-minded professor gravely felt and removed the little cocked hat, looked at it a minute, and then threw back his head and laughed like a merry bass viol.
"Ah, I see him now. It is that imp Tina who makes me a fool with my cap. Well, it is nothing. But see you, if this lesson goes not well, you too shall wear him."
But the lesson did not go at all for a few minutes, because Mr. Bayer caught sight of a picture on the hat, and unfolding it, said with a great disgust,
"I wish these papers did not come in the house. They are not for children to see, nor young people to read. It is not well, and I have no patience with those who make this harm."
Jo glanced at the sheet and saw a pleasing illustration composed of a lunatic, a corpse, a villain, and a viper. She did not like it, but the impulse that made her turn it over was not one of displeasure, but fear, because for a minute she fancied the paper was the volcano. It was not, however, and her panic subsided as she remembered that even if it had been, and one of her own tales in it, there would have been no name to betray her. She had betrayed herself, however, by a look and a blush, for though an absent man, the professor saw a good deal more than people fancied. He knew that Jo wrote, and had made her down among the newspaper office, He knew that Jo wrote, and had met her down among the newspaper offices more than once, but as she never spoke of it, he asked no questions in spite of a strong desire to see her work. Now it occurred to him that she was doing what she was ashamed to own, and it troubled him. He did not say to himself, It is none of my business. I've no right to say anything, as many people would have done. He only remembered that she was young and poor, and a girl far away from mother's love and father's care, and he was moved to help her with an impulse as quick and natural as that which would prompt him to put out his hand to save a baby from a puddle. All this flashed through his mind in a minute, but not a trace of it appeared in his face, and by the time the paper was turned and Joe's needle threaded, he was ready to say quite naturally, but very gravely, "Yes, you are right to put it from you. I do not think that good young girls should see such things. They are made pleasant to some, but I would more rather give my boys gunpowder to play with than this bad trash." All may not be bad, only silly, you know, and if there is a demand for it, I don't see any harm in supplying it. Many very respectable people make an honest living out of what are called sensation stories, said Joe, scratching gathers so energetically that a row of little slits followed her pen. "There is a demand for whiskey, but I think you and I do not care to sell it. If the respectable people knew what harm they did, they would not fear that the living was honest. They have no right to put poison in the sugar plum and let the smaller ones eat it. No, they should think a little and sweep mud in the street before they do this thing." Mr. Bayer spoke warmly and walked to the fire, crumpling the paper in his hands. Joe sat still, looking as if the fire had come to her, for her cheeks burned long after the cocked hat had turned to smoke and gone harmlessly up the chimney. "I should like much to send all the rest after him," muttered the professor, coming back with a relieved air. Joe thought what a blaze her pile of papers upstairs would make, and her hard-earned money lay rather heavily on her conscience at that minute. Then she thought consolingly to herself, "Mine are not like that. They are only silly, never bad, so I won't be worried." And taking up her book, she said with a studious face, "Shall we go on, sir? I'll be very good and proper now." "I shall hope so," was all he said, but he meant more than she imagined, and the grave, kind look he gave her made her feel as if the words "weekly volcano" were printed in large type on her forehead. As soon as she went to her room, she got out her papers and carefully reread every one of her stories. Being a little short-sighted, Mr. Bayer sometimes used eyeglasses, and Joe had tried them once, smiling to see how they magnified the fine print of her book. Now she seemed to have on the professor's mental or moral spectacles also, for the faults of these poor stories glared at her dreadfully and filled her with dismay. "They are trash, and will soon be worse trash if I go on, for each is more sensational than the rest. I've gone blindly on, hurting myself and other people for the sake of money. I know it's so, for I can't read this stuff in sober earnest without being horribly ashamed of it. And what should I do if they were seen at home or Mr. Bayer got hold of them?" Joe turned hot at the bare idea and stuffed the whole bundle into her stove, nearly setting the chimney afire with the blaze. "Yes, that's the best place for such inflammable nonsense. I'd better burn the house down, I suppose, than let other people blow themselves up with my gunpowder," she thought as she watched the demon of the Jura whisk away a little black cinder with fiery eyes. But when nothing remained of all her 3 months' work except a heap of ashes and the money in her lap, Joe looked sober as she sat on the floor wondering what she ought to do about her wages. "I think I haven't done much harm yet and may keep this paid for my time," she said after a long meditation, adding impatiently, "I almost wish I hadn't any conscience. It's so inconvenient. If I didn't care about doing right and didn't feel uncomfortable when doing wrong, I should get on capitally. I can't help wishing sometimes that mother and father hadn't been so particular about such things. Ah, Joe, instead of wishing that, thank God that father and mother were particular, and pity from your heart those who have no such guardians to hedge them round with principles which may seem like prison walls to impatient youth, but which will prove sure foundations to build character upon in womanhood. Joe wrote no more sensation stories, deciding that the money did not pay for her share of the sensation, but going to the other extreme, as is the way with people of her stamp. She took a course of Mrs. Sherwood, Miss Edgeworth, and Hannah Moore, and then produced a tale which might have been more properly called an essay or a sermon, so intensely moral was it. She had her doubts about it from the beginning, for her lively fancy and girlish romance felt as ill at ease in the new style as she would have done masquerading in the stiff and cumbrous costume of the last century. She set this didactic gem to several markets, but it found no purchasers, and she was inclined to agree with Mr. Dashwood that morals didn't sell. Then she tried a child's story, which she could easily have disposed of if she had not been mercenary enough to demand filthy liqueur for it. The only person who offered enough to make it worth her while to try juvenile literature was a worthy gentleman who felt it his mission to convert all the world to his particular belief. But much as she liked to write for children, Jo could not consent to depict all her naughty boys as being eaten by bears or tossed by mad bulls because they did not go to a particular Sabbath school, nor all the good infants who did go as rewarded by every kind of bliss, from gilded gingerbread to escorts of angels when they departed this life with psalms or sermons on their lisping tongues. So nothing came of these trials. And Jo corked up her inkstand and said in a fit of very wholesome humility, "I don't know anything. I'll wait until I do before I try again, and meantime sweep mud in the street if I can't do better. That's honest at least." Which decision proved that her second tumble down the beanstalk had done her some good. While these internal revolutions were going on, her external life had been busy and uneventful as usual, and if she sometimes looked serious or a little sad, no one observed it but Professor Bayer. He did it so quietly that Jo never knew he was watching to see if she would accept and profit by his reproof. But she stood the test, and he was satisfied. For though no words passed between them, he knew that she had given up writing. Not only did he guess it by the fact that the second finger of her right hand was no longer inky, but she spent her evenings downstairs now, was met no more among newspaper offices, and studied with a dogged patience, which assured him that she was bent on occupying her mind with something useful, if not pleasant. He helped her in many ways, proving himself a true friend, and Jo was happy. For while her pen lay idle, she was learning other lessons besides German and laying a foundation for the sensation story of her own life. It was a pleasant winter, and a long one, for she did not leave Mrs. Kirk till June. Everyone seemed sorry when the time came. The children were inconsolable, and Mr. Bayer's hair stuck straight up all over his head, for he always rumpled it wildly when disturbed in mind. "Going home? Ah, you are happy that you have a home to go in," he said when she told him, and sat silently pulling his beard in the corner while she held the little Livy on that last evening. She was going early, so she bade them all goodbye overnight, and when his turn came, she said warmly, "Now, sir, you won't forget to come and see us, if you ever travel our way, will you? I'll never forget you if you do, for I want them all to know my friend."
"Do you? Shall I come?"
he asked, looking down at her with an eager expression which she did not see. "Yes, come next month. Laurie graduates then, and you'd enjoy commencement as something new."
"That is your best friend of whom you speak?"
he said in an altered tone. "Yes, my boy Teddy. I'm very proud of him and should like you to see him." Joe looked up then, quite unconscious of anything but her own pleasure in the prospect of showing them to one another. Something in Mr. Bayer's face suddenly recalled the fact that she might find Laurie more than a best friend, and simply because she particularly wished not to look as if anything was the matter, she involuntarily began to blush, and the more she tried not to, the redder she grew. If it had not been for Tina on her knee, she didn't know what would have become of her. Fortunately, the child was moved to hug her, so she managed to hide her face an instant, hoping the professor did not see it. But he did, and his own changed again from that momentary anxiety to its usual expression as he said cordially, "I fear I shall not make the time for that, but I wish the friend much success, and you all happiness. God bless you." And with that, he shook hands warmly, shouldered Tina, and went away. But after the boys were abed, he sat long before his fire with a tired look on his face and the hem-way of homesickness lying heavy at his heart. Once he remembered Joe as she sat with the little child in her lap and that new softness in her face. He leaned his head on his hands a minute and then roamed about the room as if in search of something that he could not find.
"It is not for me. I must not hope it now,"
he said to himself with a sigh that was almost a groan. Then, as if reproaching himself for the longing that he could not repress, he went and kissed the two tousled heads upon the pillow, took down his seldom used meerschaum, and opened his Plato. He did his best, and did it manfully, but I don't think he found that a pair of rampant boys, a pipe, or even the divine Plato were very satisfactory substitutes for wife and child at home. Early as it was, he was at the station next morning to see Joe off, and thanks to him, she began her solitary journey with the pleasant memory of a familiar face smiling its farewell, a bunch of violets to keep her company, and the best of all, the happy thought, well, the winter's gone, and I've written no books, earned no fortune, but I've made a friend worth having, and I'll try to keep him all my life.